Okay, I've explained this before, but maybe it was maybe the first week or before people were paying attention. I don't know, but I know that some of you have a hard time understanding my English, um, and so especially for you, but it might be beneficial to everybody as you know, I don't know, for whatever reason, to understand what I'm talking about. Um, there is, let me move this down here. You can see what you can read what I'm saying if you open up a transcript. Now it's also the CC will, if you want to watch it all again, that would also let you read while you're listening. But there's also a transcript that you could copy and just print out and have to scan and see what I'm talking about. So if you hit the dot 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 at the bottom here, one of the options is open transcript. That's tied to the closed caption system. So if you open up the transcript, um, on my version anyway, it opens up to the right of it. Sometimes it opens up at the bottom below the video. It's not perfect. Most common words are perfect, are fine, but especially if it's a proper noun, it has no way of perceiving what somebody's name is. It's not in the database. And so even if I speak my own name, Ken Harvey, it probably would not understand what that means. It's not in the database. So again, for those of you that struggle understanding what I'm saying, please go. You can copy and paste this transcript into a Word document or whatever, and you'll have that to refer to as you're doing, preparing for your quizzes, as you're preparing your journal entry, whatever. Okay. Now it doesn't. You can't. I don't think you can just click in here and hit Control A like in some documents. Maybe. Well, it's capturing everything on the screen, and so you do have to. If you want to copy out the transcript, you're just going to have to get in here and hold down your button and just go straight down the transcript. It's going to put in the numbers, the seconds of the exactly when I said what I'm saying at that time, and so forth. So, and you may have to. For those that don't know it, no, it's okay. The right click is okay. But you can also copy is usually you can hit a Control C on your keyboard and copy whatever's highlighted as well. So there's sometimes you catch yourself into a program or something where you want to copy something and you don't. There's no command for copy. So Control C on the keyboard should copy it. And Control V pastes it. If you don't have for some reason then don't have a paste function, it's Control V to paste. Okay, I just wanted to review that again for those of you that have trouble understanding my English. That it's all, like I say, it's not perfect, but most of what I say is pretty understandable if you copy out the transcript. Okay. Our topic is today habit 3, putting first things first. So again, we've seen this diagram before, so now we're on habit 3, put first things first. And again, this is part of becoming independent as we become proactive and take on the responsibility that we ourselves are in control of our fate. And what other people do to us, yes, it might affect us, but it doesn't keep us down, so to speak. They may knock us down, we can get up and we can keep moving forward. And so being proactive and accepting that opportunity and responsibility is the first and most important habit, beginning with the end in mind. Again, that's compared to, again, the first creation, he calls it. You're creating something first in your mind. If you don't create it in your mind, somebody else may give it to you and say, here, do this, and you may be somebody else's flunky the rest of your life. But ideally, you create your own future if you're being proactive. But the third one then is putting first things first is the management function. So again, as I said, putting first things first is the principle of personal management. Things which matter most must never be at the mercy of things which matter the least. And yet, as we talk about it today, I think you will come to understand that that is the case. And many times we do the things that are least important first. We do not prioritize properly. And there's a reason for it, and I'll explain it as we proceed. But I invite you to think about this as we do proceed in this lesson. When do you put less important things ahead of things that are more important? So as I said a second ago, there's leadership and management. Leadership refers to habit 2, and management refers to habit 3. Efficient management without effective leadership is, as one individual phrased it, like straightening deck chairs on the Titanic. No management success can compensate for failure in leadership. But leadership is hard because we're often caught in the management paradigm. So not to take too much of our time going back to last week's lesson, I can absolutely understand what he's saying here. My dad, I learned my bad habits from my dad, as well as my good habits. But one of his bad habits was, and it doesn't look like a bad habit on the surface, but he always had to be the hardest worker. You say, well, what's bad about that? Well, and I'm the hardest worker at most universities. I usually leave here after 10 o'clock at night. So what's wrong with that? Well, that means I'm ignoring other things. And in his case, he was ignoring, well, I think I already told you the story previously of the oil executive who decided that after taking these lessons from Dr. Covey, decided he had to turn the management function, I guess I was going to say, over to other people and stop trying to be the manager, that he had to be the leader. And in so doing, he like tripled their income in 6 months or something, because he had the time then to develop relationships, develop new ideas, and really be the leader. When my dad was, I don't know, in his 50s, I guess it was, he got rheumatoid arthritis in his hands particularly. And for a farmer, that's not a good thing, because now he couldn't do as much, and it was really it's painful. And the harder he worked, the more painful it was, and the more problems it would cause in this future. And so he tried hiring people. Most of this was coming on after his 3 sons, me and my 2 brothers, had left the farm. But even before that, he was always the one that had to work the hardest. He was the strongest. He was very strong, more than twice as strong than I am. And I'm not weak. I usually can beat people in arm wrestling and stuff. But he would challenge us he would hold up one hand, okay, grab me with both hands and try to, control my arm. We could never. Nobody in the family could control his arm. His arm was at least twice as strong as ours. With both hands, we could not control his one arm. And so he was proud of that. He was proud of being a hard worker. So when he started getting rheumatoid arthritis, he would hire somebody and they'd be down digging a ditch or something. And he'd get tired of watching them piddle around. And so he'd say, let me do that. And they'd grab the shovel and then he would show them how to do it, how a real man would do it, so to speak. But he had to get off the farm then. He could not control himself. He had to be the worker. In some of my businesses, I've found myself trapped in the same mindset, that I had to show people that I was not afraid of doing the hard work. And so I might be out distributing newspapers and stuff rather than being a leader. And I can see, looking back, I can see that really hurt. In some cases, hurt my business in lots of ways. And so I can totally attest, and I can understand why the oil executive did so much better when he stopped being the manager. And that's hard. We'll talk a little bit more as we proceed through this about the importance of delegating. That in time management, you need to learn when you can delegate to somebody else and when you should and could and arrange to have other people do certain functions that you don't need to do, that are not dependent on your leadership. They are just management or even workers level. You need to delegate those out. So you have more time doing what you need to be doing if you want to be a successful leader. You need time, and that you only have that if you delegate some stuff, because otherwise stuff, in other words, the little things we were talking about, the little things will consume the big things. You'll have 24 hours a day, and if you insist on being the laborer and the manager, you'll never be the leader. That's the problem, because you don't have time then. So uh, what I was leading to there was, I think I mentioned last week also that Dr. Covey himself was a regional executive for a international corporation before he went back to school to work on his doctorate and then got a job at the university itself. But before that, he was a corporate executive. And so his boss over him, when he got a new boss, the old boss was somebody like most bosses who like to somewhat micromanage. The new boss said, I'm not going to micromanage. You are the one responsible for this area. You have to make the decisions. And whenever Covey had a question, something big was coming up, he would call him, at least initially, he was calling him and say, what do you think I should do? Because the previous boss and almost all bosses would like you to know what they think and like to tell you what to do. And yet you're the one on the front lines, the one that are closer to the situation. And so his new boss said, no, I'll tell you what I did in a similar situation, but you have to make the decision because you are the one on the front line, so to speak. By the way, I told you about that project I had in Kazakhstan where we've gotten $10 million to help do training of non-government organizations. That was actually the number one issue when the Peace Corps worker came to me and wanted to write a book and wanted to have a conference. It was because she saw that international donors, people like Soros, for example, would micromanage how the money was spent. Whereas the local people on the front lines were the ones who actually knew what was going on. They had a better insight as to how the money should be spent, but they were being controlled by the international donors. And so part of her purpose when she came to me was, let's write a book. We'll be able to explain why it's important for people in the front lines to have more decision-making capability. And so it kind of grew from there. I taught them how to tell their story better. That would also help them get grants and help them to keep grants, help them to influence the public to support their projects and stuff. But again, the idea that the Peace Corps worker came to me with was that point, that frontline workers understand what the problems are in the front lines. And the leaders should not be, they really should not be, even though most of them are inclined to do it, not just with NGOs, but in business as well. They're inclined to impose their opinions on people who actually know better what's going on. And so it's actually double, there's two reasons why a leader should be a leader. One is that you really need a leader in an organization, all the functions of a leader. But the other one is you should be leaving the managers alone and letting them do their own job and making them responsible. And so part of delegation is to make sure that your managers manage themselves. Don't tell them what to do all the time. And Covey found that he was a much better employee once his boss made him be the manager, truly the manager. That he did take his job much more seriously. He spent more time in his free time thinking about what he should do, and so forth, because now it was his responsibility. He didn't have somebody who was micromanaging him from above. And so it made him work harder and better, both. So the second creation is the one we're talking about. Habit 3 is the second creation, the physical creation. It's the fulfillment of the actualization, the natural emergence of habits 1 and 2. So again, habit one is be proactive, take charge, take responsibility. Habit 2 is having creating making that first creation in your mind. What should I do to be successful? And then the habit 3 is to make sure that it's really a time management question. Is the most important thing you can do um, in being a successful manager or a successful person, really, is to manage your time properly. I'm going to just go ahead with the slides, and then I'll come back to and we'll watch whatever videos we can at the end. Even though it would make more sense, I guess, to watch them at the same time. We didn't actually have time for any of the videos on Tuesday. So I just make sure we get through the slides, then we'll come back and watch some videos. So what one thing, this is a question for you personally, for your personal management. The question he asked is, what one thing could you do in your professional life, and what one thing could you do in your personal life that would really change your destiny? Now, it may not, right now, you're somewhat controlled by a university and your function as a student. And so this question, actually, you're doing one of those things. You're getting an education. You're getting your degree. That's going to open doors you wouldn't have had if you would not have come here, obviously. And so maybe, in a sense, this question probably was answered for you by your parents, maybe, but nonetheless, before you came here, that question was somewhat answered. What can you do to improve your personal life and your professional life? Go get a degree. Okay, so that was maybe answered for you, maybe not. Maybe it was your choice. But regardless, this is the fulfillment of an obvious step in making your life better. But once you graduate, now you have more decisions that you will be responsible for. Your parents might still give you their suggestions. For example, some of your parents will suggest you go on to your graduate degree, something like that. And that's, for you. I think you should be making, at that point, you should be making the decision. But it's not a bad decision to go get a graduate degree. But in my case, I might have gone straight to get my master's degree, except, like I said, the publisher of the newspaper came to my professor looking for somebody that was about to graduate that my professor thought would be a good editor. And so I would have stayed in school. I know I was going to stay at least one more semester because I was going to get my teaching certificate, so I could teach in a high school or something if I wanted to. But it was my professor then that came and said, "Here, you have this opportunity. You can go become an editor at a big city in Tampa, Florida, or you can continue." Basically, I had that choice at that point. And so I jumped at the opportunity, especially when I realized that they were going to pay me more than school teachers were making at that time anyway. So why go for another semester to get my certificate to teach when I can make more money and still graduate? I had at least 15 credits more than I needed to graduate. In America, schools let you do that. So they don't limit how many credits you can get. And so I already had all the credits I needed plus 15 credits more. I did have to test out of one course there were a couple of required courses that I had not taken. And so one of them I had to test out of. That university allowed me to take the final exam without going to class. And so I took the final exam and passed that class. And then another one was I took by correspondence. In those days was a written correspondence through the mail. And I got that one done over the next month. Anyway, that choice I had to make. But then, after about 5 years in the industry, then I had a new choice. I sold my newspaper. I had some money in my pocket. What's my best investment? And I decided my best investment was investing in my brain. And so I invested into my brain and went back for my master's degree. So along the way, you have those decisions to make. What should I do? But as you get older, again, the more options, in some ways, the fewer obvious options, the more not so obvious options come before you. And I may have used him as the example before, but the obvious example to me, since we're studying him, is Stephen Covey. You know, he had 10 kids, a wife, he had responsibilities in the community. You know, he's a community leader. He was uh, a professor at the time. Well, maybe he wasn't at that time. At that time, I think he was maybe still working in a different position at the university in administration. I'm not sure when he made the switch. But anyway, he had finished. He might have made the switch by then because he did finish his PhD, and his PhD was the impetus for him to study all the writings over the previous couple hundreds of years about success, how to achieve success. And so he had a lot of the research he'd already done, but still here he was working full time, 10 kids, a wife, community responsibilities, lots. You know, he could easily absorb his 24 hours a day with all of that, right? Um, but he himself had to be proactive. He himself had to manage his time, and he himself just had committed to himself, I'm going to now write a book. And so he had to put aside some time every day to work on his book. The problem is that most people don't do that, is they allow all those other things to absorb all their time. And so the question here, if you can again put yourself into Stephen Covey's position, so to speak, if he asked himself, what one thing can I do that will really change my professional life? Well, his decision was to write a book. And that took a lot of his time that was other people were clamoring for. But he had to set aside that time, and he put that as a very high priority. So how do you do that? When you have so many responsibilities, so many roles to play in your life, how do you do that? And so again, that's what we're talking about. But this is as you go through your life, even if now your decision's made, you have to graduate, and that's your big goal that would change your life. This is one that you can ask yourself time and time again throughout your life. I still ask myself this question. What one thing can I do right now that will dramatically change my professional or my family life? You don't get too old to ask that question until maybe you are in a wheelchair, and even then, maybe when your mind goes, I guess. When your mind goes, I guess you can't think about the question anymore. But there are people who have become famous after they're substantially older than I am. That's when they finally got around to writing their book, literally or figuratively. And so there are people who became famous when they're 80 years old or something, for example, by writing a book or something. So there's no reason for me or anybody to say, I'm done, I quit. So as you look at your tasks that you have each day, they kind of fall into these categories. At the very top are things that are urgent and important. Now, according to Covey, those are not the same. We think of them the same, and sometimes people impose things that are urgent by saying they're important. But they're not. That's not the same thing. Urgent is something that has to be done right away, according to somebody. Usually, urgent things are things that other people are imposing on us. They're not things that we're coming up with. Now, that's not always true. There are some things that, bills we have to pay, or we're going to get penalized, or, there are things in our own life that are urgent and important that we have to take care of. But very, 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 very frequently in our lives, other people are telling us what's important when they really mean urgent, that it has to be done now, and they don't want to do it themselves, so they're asking you to do it. And in the bigger view of things, actually what they're asking us to do is not very important. Maybe, like, for example, I complain a lot about academic affairs. This university has us do more paperwork than any other university I've ever worked for. And the paperwork, if you look at it on its own, and it's not just the university, by the way, it is also, again, the Ministry of Education, or the accrediting body, the quality assurance organization that works with the Ministry of Education. They think that by filling out a lot of analytical paperwork, we'll become better teachers. But they have so much analytical paperwork that it takes time away from being a good teacher. And so I was not, I may have been, I mean, I'm the first one to say it to my ears. I concluded doing all this paperwork is counterproductive, makes me a worse teacher, not a better teacher. Even though the ideas, they're asking us to analyze our teaching and stuff, but it's kind of like memorizing stuff, like, memory-based quizzes and stuff. You go through it and it doesn't do anything for you. You really need more time to be a good teacher. And most of us are putting way more than our 40 hours a week into this job. And they're asking us to put more time into it, basically, by filling out paperwork. One of the things that, I don't think I actually put it into my slideshow, but one of the things that, what's his name? The guy whose name I told you not to forget, the guy who created management, forget his name. But anyway, one of the things he said was, one of the worst things, one of the worst things that leaders can do is to waste the time of managers or of workers, as far as I go. And the research that I did not talk about in class, but I sent you a notice on, that survey, kind of confirms that employees, when they were asked about what percentage of their work they felt was really contributing to the main goals of the company, it was like they thought about half their time was. The other half they thought was basically not really contributing to the ultimate goals of the organization. So in other words, they're saying this really is not that important. We are filling out paperwork. We're doing something that's not that important. That guy also said basically the worst thing you can do is have too many meetings. Because again, if the leader has all these meetings with managers, you're just wasting their time. It's not necessary to have too many. You need some, but you don't need. Too often, leaders think they have to have meetings, and more than they need. So anyway, again, the difference between urgent and important is very important in understanding the matrix that Dr. Covey has created. Other stuff, as I said, is really important, but it's not urgent. So, for example, Dr. Covey writing the book, was that urgent? Not urgent. So you'll find there's 4 quadrants in his analysis of how we spend our time. These 4 things here. One he says that will make the difference between somebody who's really successful is this one, because that's the thing that nobody's saying you have to do, and so it takes more self-discipline than anything, because obviously things that are urgent and important are vital. You have to do those, but you don't have to remind yourself because somebody's telling you that it's urgent and important, and so you have to do it. Whereas something that's not urgent but important, like writing a book, it takes total self-discipline and understanding of what's really important and a prioritizing of what's really important. Making sure, in his case, for example, he might have put on a schedule maybe an hour a day. Maybe when the kids went to bed, he had his hour to work on his book, for example. Even 1 hour a day, it may take a year, but you can do that. You can accomplish great things if you can put in 1 hour a day to it. And since he'd already done a lot of the research for his PhD, that might have been all it took for him, was 1 hour a day. But he needed to do that 1 hour a day every day. He couldn't make excuses and say, I better go help my little girl or whatever. He had to find that 1 hour a day for both his sake and his family's sake. After all, his book was making him $500 million a year, at least him and his organization, when he finally did write it and became famous. So you can do a lot of stuff for your kids if you're making $500 million a year. That's what I meant, but $500 million a year is pretty good. Anyway, there are other things that somebody's telling us is urgent, but when you really analyze it, such as paperwork or AA, it's not really that important. And yet we're spending our time on it, and we're letting them tell us to spend our time on it, and maybe we have to. I don't know. I spend a lot of time in universities ignoring people when they tell me something's urgent, and I think you have to. I was able to get away with a lot better at KeyMap. They're harder to get around here, frankly. And then there's the stuff that's not urgent and not important, video games, watching TV excessively, whatever. We know what falls into there. Okay. And so sometimes we may even steal from the things that are really important and put it in that last category that is absolutely not important, but we want to do it anyway. So when you put this in a matrix form, it looks like this. Quadrant 1 are things that are urgent and important. So it's crises, pressing problems, deadline-driven projects, and so forth. And again, we don't really have to we know those things. Even if we're our own boss, even if we have our own business, we don't have to be reminded about those things. Those are at the top of our head. We know we have to do that. But quadrant 2 is what I said makes a difference whether you're really going to be successful or not. It's how you control your time to provide time. First off, know what to put into quadrant 2. That's part of your leadership. What am I putting in my quadrant 2? That will change my life. Answering that question that I asked. What one thing could you do that would totally change your destiny? That goes into quadrant 2. Something you're not doing now. If you do it, it'll change your destiny. By definition, it's going into quadrant 2. You don't have to do it. But you're saying it's one of the most important things you could do. So plunk that into quadrant 2. Quadrant 3, somebody's telling us it's important, but what they really mean is urgent, and it's not really that important. This is the area where you're most likely to be able to delegate. I decided last week I was going to hire somebody. The university's not paying for it. I decided it's worth 400 ringgit a month to have an assistant, because there's so much paperwork and stuff like that to do. In order to provide myself enough time to do the things in quadrant 2, it just made sense to have an assistant. And so I did. I decided I'm not going to wait for a grant. I have applied for a grant to get an assistant. And if I get the grant, I'll have a second assistant. I'm going to keep the first one anyway, because it's so important to be able to delegate stuff. And so if I have people to delegate stuff to, then I can be a more effective person. So what really you need to know about quadrant 3 is this can all be delegated, or a lot of it can be delegated, and you should try to figure out how to delegate it, how to push this off on somebody else. If it's urgent, that suggests it really does have to be done, but if it's not important, maybe you don't have to do it. So find somebody else who can do that. And then quadrant 4, one thing about quadrant 4 is understand is that quadrant 4 includes things that can be quadrant 2. Now, how so? Well, that's not writing your book, no. But part of quadrant 2 should be taking care of your health. And so you should be doing exercise every day. But that could also be in quadrant 4. You could be doing too much exercise every day. I was talking to somebody just this last Sunday whose husband bicycles like 30 kilometers every morning and 40 kilometers or 50 kilometers every night. Well, he must be in really good shape, but that's a lot of time. You're spending a lot of time on that. And unless that's really your profession, unless there's somehow that pays off, I'm saying even that's falling in quadrant. Some of that's falling in quadrant 4. I can see 2 hours a day bicycling, and that's, again, if you're not a professional. I don't know what he does professionally, but if you're again, I love putting 2 hours a day into physical fitness. I can't always do that, but I would prefer to do that. And I think it would be better for me. 1 hour a day seems to do a pretty good job, but I could certainly lose a little bit of my belly still. And that takes 2 hours a day, not 1 hour a day. But for my age, I'm in pretty good shape already. So my point is quadrant 4 items can be in quadrant 2 if they're not in excess. And even entertainment, watching a movie, going to theater, something like that, can be quadrant 2. Once you get married, you need to spend quality time with your spouse, things like that. That's a quadrant 2 thing. That's relationship building. And there's no more important relationship once you get married than your spouse. And so some things in 4 belong in 2. But excessively, if in excess, yeah, there are things that could be replaced and replaced by things in quadrant 2. So again, just a reminder slide that says pretty much what I said before. You do need to understand the difference in the bottom bullet, bottom bullet item, the difference between urgent and important. They are very different. And you need to understand that your success will come in your, that third item is pivotal in your becoming successful, and that is managing yourself, and that means managing your time. And there's nothing more important, really, than your time. Well, what can you say is more important than your time? I mean, that's the basis for everything you accomplish, right? And so if you don't manage your time, you have a hard time being very successful. And so again, these three, the being proactive, begin with the end in mind, putting first things first, all kind of come together. And one reason why a proactive person can be 5,000% more effective than somebody who's not proactive, if this is part of what they're doing, is they are managing their time properly, they're using it properly, they're prioritizing it properly, then that will be part of why they'll be 5,000% more effective than somebody who's not proactive. Somebody who's not proactive is not going to think this way. They're not going to be managing their time properly. They're also not going to be doing habit 2 very effectively. They're not going to begin with the end in mind. So they're going to be doing a lot of stuff that leads them off in different directions that isn't getting them where they want to go. And so all these come together. Take responsibility, set your vision, figure out what is your end, and then manage your time so you can accomplish that. And if you don't do that, then again, the other ones are they're not irrelevant, but you're not going to be nearly as effective even if you have a vision, if you're not managing your time, you're not turning that vision into reality. And so they have to come together. Again, we'll come back to that. Watch what we can. Again, this has some other stuff in it, in the quadrants that you can review. Again, it suggests that, some mail is mail or email, you could say, is very important. Some mail or email could be delegated. It's in the area of urgent, but not important. And some mail and email and social media, stuff like that, is definitely in the quadrant 4, and it's taking your time from things that are more important. So, some things can be in multiple locations, and that's just the reality. Another one with some other options I just put in there. The key is not to prioritize what's on your schedule, but to schedule your priorities. What does that mean? So you can put a bunch of stuff on your schedule and not include the answer to the question about what should be in quadrant 2, because you haven't asked the question yet. You haven't asked yourself, what the one thing could I be doing every day or on a regular basis that would change my destiny? If you haven't asked yourself that question, then it's not on your schedule. So prioritizing your schedule is pretty much irrelevant if you don't have the right stuff on the schedule. And so when you create your schedule, the very first thing on that schedule should be in somewhat order of the quadrants. Certainly quadrant 1 needs to be there because that's urgent and important. But right after that should be quadrant 2. And then you should fit the other stuff into it as best you can and figure out, if it doesn't all fit, how you're going to delegate, how you're going to somehow get rid of some of that stuff so that you can do the quadrant 2 things. But every day, the things that are important should be the things that you are emphasizing. And that includes quadrant 2, which nobody is telling you have to do. So even as a student, there may be things like that where maybe with a little extra effort, you could be doing better than you're doing now. But gee, there's so many other things I want to do, and so you don't put in that extra effort, that could make all the difference. Um, I think the difference in time of good students and not so good students is not that great. It doesn't take that much more time to become a really good student if you struggle with that. But it does take prioritizing and recognizing and having good strategies, like I was saying, of how to do it, how to accomplish that. So as you set your schedule, again, you're not uh, prioritizing your schedule. You're scheduling your priorities, and that's the difference. You're making sure that your priorities are on that schedule, because otherwise they might not even show up there, especially quadrant 2 items. So it takes some discipline, some self-discipline. We must have the discipline to prioritize our day-to-day actions based on what is most important, not what is most urgent. We should plan according to the nature of the thing. We should make weekly schedules. So not only the daily schedules, but a weekly schedule is really important. I found that makes a big difference for me. If I make sure there's one thing, especially in quadrant 2, that I have a weekly schedule so I can work on that. You know, it's a big item. It doesn't have, it's not urgent, it's not tied to one day or 2 days. But I shouldn't let Saturday pass until I've accomplished that. So I may be working all day Saturday on it. But you know, that I set it on my schedule, this one thing I'm going to do this week. Now you can break that down and try to figure out what you're going to do every day, but sometimes your daily schedules don't turn out the way you want them to. Things happen, but you have more control over your weekly schedule. If you have, you know, some important things, your most important things scheduled for the week, you have a little more control over it. And if you do so, then of course, you know, you will have better control over your time. You'll have greater success. It guarantees greater success in completing your tasks. And you don't get in a situation where you're panicking. That has to do more with the quadrant 1, things that are urgent and important. You prioritize them. You've taken care of them. You haven't waited to the last minute. But that's also true. And in fact, I think one of the things that you might say it's a psychological trick, and that is treat your quadrant 2 things that are important but not urgent as if they're urgent. In other words, you put them in your schedule just by putting them in your schedule, and if you develop the habit of not letting that week, especially you're scheduling something for every week. If you have a weekly schedule, and this is another reason why I think you should look at it from a weekly basis. Otherwise, you hurt your habit. But if you know that every week you have a big chunk of your quadrant 2 goal sitting in that week, if you make a promise to yourself, Saturday will not pass until this is done. I'd like to do it before that. I'm scheduling so that I can be done by Friday so I don't have to work on Saturday, perhaps. But I will not let Saturday pass without completing that quadrant 2 commitment. Now you turn it psychologically from quadrant 2 to quadrant 1. If you can do that, then that changes the whole ballgame. But that takes some self-discipline, and again, you kind of have to fool yourself a little bit, but it's a habit. You make at least one key thing in quadrant 2 on your weekly schedule and promise yourself. And if you will keep that promise week after week after week, now you're going to make some really serious headway on it. The top part here is basically from last week. You have your mission statement. You consider your different roles in life, and you set your goals. Your goals can be long-term goals, and as I mentioned last week, you can have your stepping stone goals to getting to your big goals. And it's important to understand that if all you have are your big goals, you're going to be very frustrated, because you're going to keep trying to tell yourself you can jump 30 meters over the creek, so to speak, over the river, and you can't make it. You have to have those stepping stone goals, and that's the only way you can truly convince yourself it's possible, um, and truly expect to fulfill your self commitments. If you don't have the stepping stone goals, then you're not really convinced you're going to be able to do it because it's too far, too wide, too unattainable from where you're at now. So uh, you can. So I would put in there the stepping stone goals as well, and then you start planning. And so every week, maybe every Sunday or whatever, you sit down and that's when you start scheduling your whole week of activities, including quadrant two. And so you set your plans, you decide what you need to do, what you can have somebody else do for you. That's an important part of your planning. What can I get somebody else to do this week so that I can focus on the more important things? Um, and so consider schedule, consider delegation, both. I wanted to add just one more thing here before ending this video. Dr. Covey, in one of the videos that we watched in class, talked about how he went to one of his, one of the individuals one of the workers that he supervised, and asked him to do something that clearly fell in the quadrant 3 area, something that was urgent but not important. And the guy, pulled down a chart and showed him all the stuff in the urgent and important quadrant that he was already working on. And so Dr. Covey immediately decided that he could find somebody else not so well organized and not so focused on the urgent important things to give the urgent and not important thing to. So one of the questions then is for you, what happens when one of your bosses comes to you and asks you to do something in the quadrant 3 area? Now, Dr. Covey, and again in the video, said, well, obviously, if your boss tells you to do it, it becomes quadrant 1. But you could also be proactive and do what his employee did to him and explain to your boss all the important things you're working on and assure him that if he wants you to delay your work on the important things, that you'll be glad to work on the unimportant thing. If he doesn't have somebody else to do that. And he could very likely do what Dr. Covey did and take it to somebody else. So it's not that you're trying to pawn it off on somebody else, but you set your priorities around the things that are really important. And if you let your bosses know that what you are working on is really important, then they may not bother you with things that are not important. So if you're better organized, you can help them be more efficient as bosses too, as leaders. So I think that's all I wanted to add to it. And so try to think about this stuff and figure out how to how to implement these ideas in your own lives.